Rachel Torres arrived at Seattle General at 6:47 in the morning, 17 minutes before her shift began. The parking lot stretched grey and empty, rain hammering the asphalt like applause nobody asked for. She'd been a temp nurse here for 8 weeks. Nobody knew her name. That was the point. The recovery ward doors hissed open and she moved through them like a ghost, badges clipped to her scrubs catching fluorescent light as she passed the nurse's station. Her shoes made no sound on the tile. She'd learned to walk that way a long time ago, in places where noise meant death. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and industrial coffee, that particular hospital smell that never quite washed out of your clothes or your hair or your skin. Dr. Caldwell stood at the medication dispensary reviewing charts, his posture carrying the weight of someone who believed the ward couldn't function without his constant supervision. He was tall, grey at the temples, the kind of doctor whose nameplate cost more than most people's monthly rent. He glanced up as Rachel passed and looked immediately back down, his expression shifting into something between dismissal and disdain. Just another temp. Replaceable. Forgettable. The kind of nurse who didn't threaten his carefully maintained hierarchy. Rachel didn't make eye contact. She never did. Her hands were already moving through the motions, checking bed assignments on the tablet, reviewing overnight notes, moving to the first room where a patient lay recovering from abdominal surgery. The man was asleep, his face tight even in unconsciousness, the kind of tension that came from pain management that wasn't quite managing. She checked his chart. Vitals stable. But the pain medication order read like a punishment rather than a protocol. 30 milligrams of morphine every 4 hours. The last dose was logged at 2:30 a.m. It was now 6:51. 4 hours and 21 minutes. The order specifically stated not to advance the administration time, which meant this man had been awake and hurting for at least the last hour, maybe longer. Rachel's jaw tightened. Just a tiny movement, barely visible. She'd learned to hide her reactions. That was survival too. She moved through the remaining rooms, documenting vitals, checking dressings, moving with the kind of precision that made her look like a medical robot programmed to perform tasks. But her eyes were taking in details that most nurses overlooked. The surgical site that looked slightly more inflamed than it should. The patient breathing in short, shallow patterns that suggested pain rather than normal sleep. The way their hands clenched the bedsheets. These were readable. These were intelligent reports written in a language her body still spoke fluently. By 8 o'clock, Dr. Caldwell had begun his official rounds, moving from patient to patient with a resident trailing behind him like a satellite. Rachel stayed 2 rooms ahead, documenting, adjusting, quietly noting the things that needed attention. She didn't speak unless spoken to. She made herself useful and invisible, the way she'd been trained to operate in spaces where her presence was tolerated but not valued. The rounds moved fast. Dr. Caldwell spoke primarily to the residents, offering brief clinical observations that carried an edge of impatience. When he did address the nurses, his tone shifted into something more condescending, the way someone might address furniture that had developed the ability to respond. He passed Rachel in the hallway around 8:30, and she pressed herself against the wall to let him through. He didn't acknowledge her. She hadn't expected him to. In the break room at 10 a.m., Rachel stood alone with her black coffee. The television mounted in the corner played some morning show she wasn't watching. Her fingers found the coffee cup's warmth, holding it like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to the present moment. Through the window, she could see the parking lot where rain continued its relentless assault on asphalt and windshields and anything else stupid enough to be outside. A younger nurse, Jennifer or Jessamine, something with a J, came in and made a small sound of frustration at the empty creamer container. She didn't speak to Rachel. Nobody did. The temp nurses existed in a professional quarantine, acknowledged only when absolutely necessary, their contributions to patient care so thoroughly dismissed that some permanent staff members seemed to forget they were even in the room during meetings. Rachel had overheard Dr. Caldwell in a staff meeting 3 weeks earlier, discussing how temporary contracts had become a problem in the hospital's budget model. "We're essentially hiring rotating trainees," he'd said, his voice carrying the precision of someone absolutely convinced of his own correctness. Their lack of institutional knowledge creates gaps in protocol compliance. What he meant was that temp nurses couldn't be controlled the same way. They weren't invested in climbing a ladder that would never have their name on it. They didn't attend the hospital's social functions or navigate the politics of the permanent hierarchy. That made them dangerous in Dr. Caldwell's mind. Unpredictable. Unmanageable. Rachel finished her coffee and returned to the ward. The post-surgical patient in room 412, Michael Chen, age 64, abdominal resection, was awake now, staring at the ceiling with the particular exhaustion of someone experiencing pain they weren't supposed to be experiencing. She checked the chart again. 8 hours and 19 minutes since his last dose. The protocol absolutely, explicitly stated every 4 hours. She stood at the bedside, looking at his vital signs on the monitor. Heart rate elevated. Blood pressure climbing. These were readable. These were indicators of distress that had nothing to do with surgical recovery and everything to do with pain management that wasn't being managed. "How are you feeling?" Rachel asked. Her voice came out soft, careful, the kind of voice that wouldn't startle someone already fragile. Michael's eyes shifted toward her. For a moment he seemed to be deciding whether it was worth the energy to respond. "Pain," he said finally. "Right side. Burning." Rachel nodded. She moved her fingers to the surgical site and very gently palpated around the incision. His muscles tensed immediately. That was informative. That was a patient telling her everything she needed to know without words. "Your morphine is due," she said. It wasn't a question. The doctor said to wait. Rachel's hands didn't move. Her face didn't change. "That doesn't match the order." She returned to the medication dispensary and pulled up Michael's chart on the computer. The order was clear. Every 4 hours. 30 milligrams. No exceptions. But there was a handwritten note in Dr. Caldwell's blocky script: hold pain management for 6 hours post-operative. Need baseline pain tolerance reading. Pain tolerance reading. Rachel read it twice. The medical rationale didn't exist. Post-operative pain management wasn't about measuring tolerance. It was about preventing the kind of physiological stress that delayed healing. It was about maintaining patient dignity. It was about not being cruel. She found Dr. Caldwell in the staff lounge reviewing a folder. His coffee sat untouched on the table beside him, steam still rising. He didn't look up when she entered. "Doctor, I wanted to clarify the pain medication protocol for Mr. Chen in 412. Dr. Caldwell's eyes flicked up, irritated. "His chart is clear. The standing protocol is every 4 hours. He's at 8 hours 20. I wrote that order. The notation says you're delaying for a pain tolerance baseline, but nothing, Rachel." He said her name like he was correcting pronunciation. "I know my own protocols. Are you questioning my judgment?" The question hung in the air between them like something physical. Rachel could feel her body responding to the confrontation, not with fear, but with the particular clarity that came from being directly challenged. Her breathing steadied. Her hands went still. "No, doctor. I'm asking for clarification." "Then here's your clarification. You're a temporary contract employee. I'm the recovery ward director. My orders don't require your approval, your clarification, or your input." He returned to his folder. "The medication stays on schedule." "Not before." Rachel nodded. She left the lounge. Her composure held because it always held. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. 8 years of military training, compressed into a single moment of compliance, waiting in her muscles like a coiled spring. But at 11:45, Dr. Caldwell walked past the supply closet just as she was checking inventory, and he stopped. He came inside and closed the door behind him. The space was small, shelves of gauze, tape, sterile gloves, medical tubing compressed into aluminum and plastic. It smelled like chemicals and storage. "I need you to understand something," Dr. Caldwell said. His voice had shifted into something quieter, which somehow made it worse. I run a tight operation here. Tight protocols. Tight staff. When someone, particularly a temporary contractor, starts questioning my clinical decisions in front of my team, it creates problems. Rachel didn't respond. She continued taking inventory, her pen moving against the clipboard. You have 6 weeks left on your contract, he continued. I can end it tomorrow. I have the authority and the documentation. One more deviation, one more question, one more challenge to my protocols, and I will. She looked at him then. Their eyes met. His were the pale blue of someone accustomed to authority never being questioned. Hers were the grey of someone who'd stared at worse across a rifle scope and didn't blink. Do you understand? Yes, doctor, she said. He left. The door closed. Rachel stood alone in the supply closet with her inventory clipboard, her heart rate exactly where it had been before the conversation started. The trembling in her hands had already stopped. She finished her shift at 3 o'clock and moved through the hallway toward the lockers. The dog tag was where she'd hidden it, wrapped in old gauze, buried beneath her spare uniform in the back of her locker. She held it for exactly 30 seconds, long enough for her thumb to trace the engraved lettering that read Torres, Rachel M. a USMC, OLF Special Forces. The broken chain hung limp from her fingers. Marcus's dog tag. Marcus, who'd been her husband and her partner and her reason to try walking away from the life that had prepared her for moments exactly like the one in the supply closet. She'd been ordered to disappear. The command had come from people with authority that existed at levels Dr. Caldwell would never comprehend. Erase yourself. Stop being what you were. Become someone forgettable. Rachel wrapped the dog tag back in gauze and returned it to its hiding place. She buttoned her locker and walked out into the parking lot where rain was still hammering against everything, patient and relentless. Behind her, through the recovery ward windows, Dr. Caldwell watched from his office, already planning how to tighten his control even further, completely unaware he was standing 3 rooms away from someone who'd spent 14 hours holding a compound in Tikrit with nothing but field medicine and a Leatherman while her medic bled out beside her. The intercom crackled at 4:51 p.m., cutting through the recovery ward like a blade. Rachel the temp to the recovery ward station. Rachel the temp. Every nurse within 50 feet stopped moving. A younger RN glanced up from her charting. The charge nurse's mouth tightened. Dr. Caldwell stood in his office doorway, watching the effect of his words ripple across the floor like stones dropped in still water. He said it again, slower this time, letting each syllable land. Rachel the temp recovery ward station. Nobody called her that. Nobody but him. Rachel was changing a bedpan in room 312 when she heard it. She set the container down with the same precision she'd once used loading magazines in the dark, straightened her scrubs, and walked toward the station. Not fast. Not slow. One measured breath as she moved. The hallway smelled of bleach and something sweet, the antiseptic they sprayed after every code, and her rubber-soled shoes made no sound on the tile. Invisible. That was the job. That was always the job. Dr. Caldwell didn't look up from his tablet when she arrived. Miss Torres. Thank you for finally joining us. His voice carried the kind of precision that came from years of never being questioned. I need clarification on something that's been troubling me. He turned the tablet slightly, as if she could read upside down from 3 feet away. She waited. The post-surgical in 347. Room 347. You questioned my medication timing this morning. Is that accurate? The patient's pain scale was an 8, Rachel said evenly. Her voice was steady as a heart monitor in normal sinus rhythm. The scheduled dose was. I don't recall asking for your clinical judgment. He looked at her directly now, and there was something underneath his gaze that wasn't anger. It was contempt. The kind that only came when someone believed you were fundamentally beneath them. I recall hiring someone to follow orders. Not to interpret protocols. not to second-guess decisions made by physicians with 23 years of experience. Do you understand the distinction?
Yes, doctor.
Do you? He stood, setting the tablet on his desk with deliberate slowness. Because it seems like there's been some confusion about your role here. You're temporary staff. Interchangeable. Your opinions on patient care are not required. Your compliance is required. Everything else is optional. He walked past her toward the medication dispensary, his shoulder nearly brushing hers. Let's be clear about where you stand. The charge nurse looked away. A medical student pretended to read the vital signs board. Rachel remained still, her jaw held at an angle that would have looked neutral to anyone who wasn't trained to see the micro-movements of stress. But she wasn't stressed. She was calculating. Already 3 steps ahead. Already knowing how this would end. 30 minutes later, Dr. Caldwell cornered her in the supply closet. The door closed almost all the way behind him, leaving just enough light from the hallway to see his face. The shelves around them were lined with gauze, tape, saline bags, the architecture of routine care. His voice dropped, and that was worse than when he'd spoken loudly. Quiet voices meant personal. One more time, Rachel. One more policy deviation. One more time you forget your place in this hierarchy, and your contract ends. You'll be out by the end of shift. Am I being unclear? She held his gaze. Not defiant. Just present. Perfectly clear, doctor. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Good. Because I've been reviewing your file, and there's remarkably little in it. Almost like you don't exist before 2 years ago. No employment history. No references from before Seattle General. Nothing. He tilted his head, studying her the way a scientist might study an organism that wasn't behaving as predicted. That's unusual. Most people have a past. Her face remained still. But something flickered, just for one frame, one heartbeat, behind her eyes. The kind of flicker that a man like Dr. Caldwell would notice precisely because he was looking for weakness. He saw it. He didn't understand what it meant, but he saw it, and he filed it away. The next evening came clear and cold. The shift change happened at 4:41 p.m., when day staff left and evening staff arrived, when the parking lot filled with 40 nurses moving between their cars and the building. Dr. Caldwell paged her at 4:27. Rachel the temp to the parking lot. Bring the cleaning supplies from the supply closet. He wasn't asking. It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered through the hospital's own voice, echoing off concrete and glass. She found him standing near the main entrance, hands in his pockets, wearing the kind of smile that comes right before something is broken. He handed her a bedpan and a bottle of disinfectant in front of everyone. The nurses arriving for their shift slowed down. One stopped completely. Another turned away. A third whispered something to her partner, who looked over at Rachel with that specific expression, the one that was supposed to be sympathy but felt like contagion. Since you're so concerned with patient care protocols, Dr. Caldwell said, loud enough for the nearest nurses to hear clearly, you can personally manage waste disposal tonight. The overflow wing needs attention. Start with the 3rd floor. He glanced around, as if inviting them all to witness this. I trust you can handle that without requiring clinical supervision. Rachel took the bedpan in her right hand. The plastic was cold. Cheap. The kind used in facilities that didn't care about quality. She took one measured breath, and in that breath, in that single moment of oxygen entering her lungs, something shifted. A single tear escaped her left eye, moving down her cheek in a perfect vertical line. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, her eyes never leaving his. When she spoke, her voice was like cold steel scraping against bone. Like a tank engine idling in the dark before the rotor wash came. I've been dressed down by better men in worse places, doctor. The crowd went silent. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A car horn sounded in the distance, muffled by the hospital walls. Dr. Caldwell's jaw tightened, just barely, just enough to show that something had landed, and he turned without responding, walking back inside while the nurses stood frozen, uncertain whether they'd actually heard what they heard or imagined it. Rachel held the bedpan against her hip and looked at the faces watching her. She didn't see pity anymore. She saw confusion. Recognition, maybe. The kind that came when someone said something that tasted like truth. Then she turned toward the overflow wing, toward the work, toward the invisibility she'd chosen. But the choice was already fracturing. That night, after her shift, Rachel returned to her locker. The fluorescent light above flickered, a sound like insects trapped in plastic, and she reached for the small shelf where her personal items sat. A hairbrush. A lock with no combination. A photograph of Marcus from 2011, his arm around her shoulders, both of them squinting into a desert sun that didn't exist anymore. And the dog tag. The single dog tag on a broken chain. She pulled it out and held it in her palm. The metal was warm from being pressed against her heart for the last 3 hours, pressed against the scrubs that smelled like disinfectant and patient rooms and the slow erosion of who she used to be. It was Marcus's. They'd broken his chain, both of them had broken chains during that operation, protocol for field agents, nothing traceable if things went wrong. She'd replaced hers years ago. She kept his in her locker like some people kept photographs of dead relatives. Like an anchor to a name that no longer existed in any database. The weight of it was nothing. 20 grams of stamped metal. But the weight of invisibility, the weight of staying quiet while a man like Caldwell built his case against her, the weight of not being allowed to exist as anything other than disposable, that was crushing. That was the kind of weight that used to break soldiers. The kind that made people choose between compliance and survival. She closed her hand around it. The metal bit into her skin, leaving faint impressions of letters and numbers. Major Rachel Torres, Special Forces. Serial number. Unit designation. Blood type O negative. But that person was dead. Pentagon orders. She was supposed to stay invisible. Stay small. Stay gone. That was the deal they'd made when they told her to disappear, when they'd erased her service record and given her a new name and told her that if she ever surfaced again, it would be worse than any discharge. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened the next morning when Rachel arrived for her shift and found that her schedule had been completely rewritten. Every day she'd worked with Maria, the only nurse who'd ever treated her like an actual person, was gone. Maria was pediatrics now. James, who'd actually respected her clinical instincts, had been transferred to the ER on permanent rotation. The charge nurse who'd looked away yesterday wouldn't meet her eyes today. Dr. Caldwell was already making phone calls. She heard him in the break room, his voice carrying through the walls with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no. Yes, she's technically competent, but there's something off about her, no employment history before 2022. I'm protecting the hospital's interests by ensuring she doesn't develop any permanent relationships within the system. Rachel stood behind the vending machine, her hand pressed against the cold metal panel, counting her breaths the way she'd learned in Tikrit when the walls closed in and the air got thin. 4 counts in. Hold for 4. 6 counts out. The panic response was manageable if you treated it like data. Pain is information. Fear is information. Even betrayal was just information. By Friday, her access to the medication dispensary required a supervisor override. 5 extra minutes on every patient interaction. A line forming behind her. Eyes on her back. Dr. Caldwell told the board it was the standard protocol for high-turnover staff, and they accepted it the way people always accepted lies that came from positions of authority. Her 16-year-old son noticed she was coming home later. Sleeping less. She deflected his questions with the same tight smile she'd worn since Marcus's funeral 3 years ago. The smile that said everything was fine. The smile that was becoming a scar. On Tuesday morning, Dr. Caldwell reassigned the last nurse who spoke to Rachel with respect. The younger RN, fresh out of nursing school, kind, competent, was moved to the orthopedic ward across the hospital. Completely isolated. Completely alone. Rachel understood the strategy. Isolation was the endgame. When you were truly alone, you had nothing to hide behind. Nothing to protect. You became visible. She stood at the nurse's station at 11:56 p.m. on Tuesday night, completely alone on the overnight recovery ward, surrounded by the hum of monitors and the antiseptic smell that had become the smell of her own slow erasure. The building was quiet. The kind of quiet that came when most of the hospital was sleeping. And that's when she heard it. Glass shattering. 3 corridors away. Then voices. Then a sound like something heavy moving where it shouldn't be. The doors burst open at 11:52 p.m. 7 feet of human rage and grief stormed through Recovery Ward B with a Glock 19 trembling in his right hand. His voice didn't sound like words, it sounded like something breaking.
"Where are the butchers who killed my brother?"
The visiting surgeon dropped his clipboard. The sound of it hitting tile echoed like a gunshot, and that was enough. 2 nurses dove behind the medication cart. A resident bolted for the stairwell, his badge clattering against the wall as he ran. Down the corridor, in his office with the door locked and the blinds drawn, Dr. Caldwell crawled under his desk like a man watching his empire collapse, his phone shaking so badly he couldn't dial security. The gunman stood in the center of the recovery ward, sweat pouring down his temples, his eyes the color of shattered glass. "He came in for routine surgery and you killed him." His left leg favored, weight shifting. His right hand trembled, not from adrenaline, but from something metabolic. His pupils were dilated but clear. His breathing was rapid, shallow, the unmistakable pattern of a blood sugar crash. Rachel was 20 feet away at the nurse's station. She set down the patient chart in her hands with deliberate care. The chart made no sound. Her heart rate didn't spike the way a civilian's would. It dropped. Fell clean and straight like it always did in Tikrit when contact was imminent, when the world narrowed to math and breathing and the next 3 seconds. She took 1 step toward him. "Sir, I can see you're hurting." Her voice wasn't loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst. He swung the gun toward her. "Don't come closer." She took another step, her hands visible and open at shoulder height. She was reading him the way she'd read 100 insurgents and angry medics and grieving men who'd lost everything to shrapnel and poor luck. His stance. His breath pattern. The way his legs were starting to shake, not from fear, from hypoglycemia. The metabolic crash she'd seen in combat medics who skipped meals during 72-hour operations. "When did you last eat?" she asked. He stopped mid-sentence. The question hung in the fluorescent-lit corridor like something heavy and unexpected. "What? When did you last eat? Your blood sugar is crashing. I can see it. You're not thinking straight because your brain is starving. That's not rage right now, that's hypoglycemia." She took another step. His weapon hand was shaking harder now, and she could see the confusion in his face competing with the grief. The confusion was winning. "You don't know anything about?" "I know what I see. I know your brother was here. I'm sorry he died. But whoever treated him in this hospital, it wasn't because of murder. It was because people make mistakes, or sometimes bodies just fail, and there's nothing anyone can do. I know that's not the answer you want. But putting 8 bullets into a recovery ward full of patients won't change what happened to him." Her voice carried the weight of someone who'd held dying men and had to tell their families why there was nothing left to hold. He lowered the gun 2 inches. "Just 2. My name is Rachel. What's your brother's name?" "David." His voice cracked. The gun wavered. "David was supposed to go home Tuesday. Tell me about him." And while she talked to him, while she kept her voice steady and her hands visible and her body between him and the patient rooms behind her, her mind was already running through the next moves. Blood glucose tablet. For access. He needed dextrose, 25 grams, fast. He needed to sit down before his legs gave out and his body went into full shock. He needed the gun on the floor and his hands where she could see them. She took another step. "Your legs are about to give out," she said. "That's the crash. You need to sit down. I'm going to help you sit down, and then I'm going to get you something to eat. And then we're going to figure out what happened to David. Can you do that for me?" His legs buckled. She caught him before his body hit the floor, her hands moving on their own, muscle memory from Tikrit, from the compound hold, from 14 hours of keeping 6 men alive when their medic was dead, and the only thing between them and bleeding out was what she could do with her hands and her knowledge and her refusal to let go. The gun fell away. It clattered across the tile floor, and 3 security officers materialized from the stairwell like they'd been waiting for exactly this sound. Rachel was already on one knee, her fingers on his neck, counting his pulse. Rapid. Thready. She could feel the tremor in his hands, see the way his pupils were responding too slowly to light. Critical hypoglycemia. Minutes away from seizure activity or cardiac arrhythmia. "I need a 50 milliliter dextrose bolus, for access, stat," she called out, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made people move. 14-gauge angiocath. He's in DKA or severe hypoglycemic crisis. Blood glucose meter. Now. One of the security officers who'd been trained in first aid started to move, but Dr. Caldwell emerged from his office, straightening his tie, his face already rearranging itself into something resembling composure. He stepped over the fallen weapon like it was a dropped napkin. "I have this situation handled," he said. His voice was steady now that the danger had passed, now that someone else had done the dangerous part. "Security will take over from here. You?" "He needs glucose," Rachel said, not looking up from the gunman's pupils. "His blood sugar is probably below 40. If we don't get for dextrose in him in the next 90 seconds, he's going to seize. That's for emergency medicine to determine. It's for basic human biology to determine. Sir, if you want him conscious when he gets to the ER, we move now." She could feel Dr. Caldwell's silence-like pressure. She could feel him calculating, the optics of her taking charge, the way his authority was cracking at the edges because she was right and everyone in the recovery ward could see that she was right. "Call it in," he said to the security officers, his voice tight. "Get the crash cart." But he was already walking back to his office. Rachel had the 4-line placed by the time the crash cart arrived, the needle going in with the smooth precision of someone who'd done it 1,000 times in far worse conditions than a quiet hospital recovery ward. The dextrose pushed through the line, and she watched the gunman's eyes clear within 30 seconds, the tremor in his hands beginning to ease, his breathing deepening as his blood sugar climbed back toward functional. She sat back on her heels, one hand still on his wrist, monitoring. "Did I hurt anyone?" the man asked, his voice small and confused. "No. You're all right. You're going to be all right." Upstairs, in his office, Dr. Caldwell locked the door and picked up his phone. His hands were still shaking, but for different reasons now. The night shift was over in 90 minutes. He knew exactly what he needed to do next. The next day, Rachel arrived for her evening shift to find her schedule had changed. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, her 3 strongest performance nights, replaced with overnight rotations. 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., every one of them. The overnight recovery ward, alone, no support staff. She read the schedule posted on the break room bulletin board without any change in her expression. No tremor. No heat in her face. Just a slight pause, the same way someone pauses before stepping into cold water. Her charge nurse for the night shift was new. Rachel had never seen her before. And when she checked the assignment board for staffing support, every name was unfamiliar. Every single tech and aide who'd worked Recovery Ward B had been reassigned. She was alone. The isolation was elegant. Systematic. It was the kind of planning that proved Dr. Caldwell wasn't just angry, he was strategic. This wasn't a man throwing tantrums. This was a man building a case, one missing piece of support at a time, one policy deviation at a time. Rachel understood exactly what was happening. He was going to document every mistake, every shortcut, every moment when working alone on an overnight shift forced her to choose between protocol and patient care. And when he had enough ammunition, he would fire her. Not because of the gunman. Because of the paper trail. She clocked in at 10:02 p.m. By midnight, she had 8 patients on a recovery ward that was designed to run with at least 2 nurses and 3 techs. By 2 a.m., a post-operative patient had developed a fever and tachycardia, and Rachel made the call to hold pain medication until infection could be ruled out, and Dr. Caldwell's notes would later describe this as excessive caution bordering on medical neglect. By 4 a.m., a patient needed catheterization, and Rachel had to step away from her monitors for 17 minutes to handle it alone, which meant the continuous pulse oximetry monitoring was interrupted, another deviation Dr. Caldwell would document as a protocol violation. She knew it was happening. She could feel the net closing with every 12-hour shift, every moment when the mathematics of care demanded she break one of his rules. And on the third night alone, around 3 a.m., when the hospital was quiet enough to hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, Rachel sat in the break room for exactly 8 minutes. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She pressed her palm against the table and felt the cool formica under her skin and thought about Marcus, about the dog tag in her locker, about the promise she'd made to stay invisible. She pressed her fingers to her eyes and took one measured breath. Then she went back to the recovery ward. What she didn't know was that Dr. Caldwell had already made calls to the hospital board, to the regional nursing director, to 3 other Seattle area hospitals and a private clinic network. He hadn't mentioned the gunman. He hadn't mentioned her heroism. He'd mentioned only the isolation, the sleepless nights, the accumulating paperwork that proved she was a liability, a temp worker with no institutional loyalty, no permanent stake in any hospital's future. The calls were subtle. Professional. The kind of calls that didn't sound like sabotage, they sounded like concerned consultation between medical administrators. By the end of her 4th consecutive overnight shift, Rachel had been documented with 6 separate protocol deviations. None of them significant. All of them inevitable when you ask one person to do the work of 3. She was walking directly into the machinery he'd already set in motion, and every shift alone was another bolt being tightened, another piece of the trap settling into place. She had no idea how deep this went. She had no idea that in 48 hours, her contract would be terminated. She had no idea what was about to arrive at her locker, what her son had found in the attic, what the Pentagon already knew, or that the moment she walked toward the gunman, everything changed. She only knew that the machinery was grinding. And she was still standing in front of it. The machinery grinding was all Rachel heard until 11:52 p.m., when the recovery ward doors exploded inward. A man 7 feet tall, maybe taller in the shadows, stood framed in the entrance with a Glock 19 trembling in his right hand. His skin had the clammy pallor of someone whose blood sugar was doing terrible things to his nervous system, and his eyes held the particular madness of grief mixed with rage and hypoglycemia. He screamed until the monitors flatlined from the sheer acoustic force of it. "Where are the butchers who killed my brother?" The room responded instantly. A resident bolted for the supply closet. 2 nurses sprinted toward the staff lounge, their shoes hammering tile in a staccato panic. A respiratory therapist locked himself in the medication room, his hand shaking so badly he couldn't get the key in the slot on the first try. Dr. Caldwell, visible for exactly 1.3 seconds in the doorway of his office, saw the gun and made a decision that would define his character more clearly than anything he'd done in 32 years of medicine. He slammed his office door and threw the deadbolt, the sound like a coffin lid closing on his conscience. Rachel was restocking the crash cart when the doors hit the frame. She didn't run. She didn't freeze. She set down the laryngoscope blade she was holding, the movement deliberate, unhurried, and turned toward the man with her hands visible at chest height, palms outward. The transformation happened beneath her own skin like a second heartbeat, something cellular and absolute. Her breathing slowed. Her vision narrowed. Muscle memory from 8 years of classified work in Tikrit took over, operating on levels below conscious thought, tracking his trigger discipline, finger alongside the guard, not on the trigger yet, his stance deteriorating, knees starting to buckle under whatever metabolic crisis was unfolding inside him, his skin tone, pale as a ghost, clammy like something freshly drowned. The way his gun hand was shaking with a particular tremor of a blood sugar that had dropped below 50. She walked toward him. Not fast. Not slow. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst the world can offer. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. The man's eyes snapped to her like she'd triggered something in him, and Rachel could see the moment he registered that someone was moving toward him instead of away. "Your brother's name was David," she said. Her voice carried the certainty of someone who'd processed a visitor log an hour ago during her paperwork, who'd read the post-op notes, who'd understood in an instant what was about to happen because she'd seen this before in other forms, grief and rage and hypoglycemia all combusting together like a Molotov cocktail. "He was here for gallbladder surgery." "You're Michael." The gun wavered. Just slightly. The use of his name, the acknowledgement that his brother had existed as something other than a target, broke through the rage for 3 seconds. That was all Rachel needed. "They killed him," Michael screamed, but his voice had fractured, become almost human again. "I know you believe that," Rachel said. She was 9 feet away now, then 8. Her hands remained visible, her posture non-threatening, but there was nothing small about her presence. "And right now your blood sugar is crashing hard. I can see it in your stance. You're about to pass out. I can help you, but I need you to lower the weapon." The certainty in her voice was the voice of someone who talked armed insurgents down from worse decisions in compounds where the walls were shaking from ordnance impact. The voice of someone who understood that desperation and malfunction looked the same from the outside but required completely different interventions. She continued in that low, absolute tone, "Michael, lower the gun." 90 seconds after the doors crashed open, Michael's legs buckled. The Glock dropped from his hand, hit the tile floor with a metallic clatter that sounded like a period at the end of a sentence nobody wanted to write. Rachel moved with the fluidity of someone whose body still remembered how to catch falling weight, whose hands had held together too many soldiers with holes in them in places where there were no hospitals. She caught him before his skull hit the floor, redistributed his weight, eased him down onto the tile with her knee as a buffer between his head and what would have been a catastrophic impact. His pulse was racing, thready. His skin was colder than it should be. Rachel's hands moved on their own, pulling the glucose monitor from her pocket, the one she'd carried since her first day, the one she'd learned from 8 years of field medicine was worth more than almost any other piece of equipment in an emergency. She checked his fingerstick while simultaneously noting his respiratory rate, the dilation of his pupils, the way his fingers were starting to shake with the particular tremor of severe hypoglycemia. Blood glucose, 42. Critical. She was already moving, rolling him into recovery position, her hands finding the 4 kit in the crash cart with the efficiency of muscle memory trained in desert bunkers with mortars landing outside the walls. 14-gauge angiocath. Tourniquet. 3 seconds to find a vein in his left arm. The needle went in clean. She was hanging dextrose, pushing 50 cubic centimeters of D50 through the line, before Dr. Caldwell even emerged from his locked office, his face flushed with what Rachel recognized as the particular shade of rage that comes from witnessing someone else become the hero. Security rounded the corner at 11:53 p.m., exactly 60 seconds after the doors exploded. Michael's eyes were already fluttering open. The seizure activity that should have followed the hypoglycemic crash never came. His color was returning. Within 2 minutes, his blood sugar would stabilize and he would be something approximating coherent again, the immediate medical emergency resolved with the kind of precision that only comes from someone who's done this before under considerably worse circumstances. Dr. Caldwell's voice boomed across the recovery ward like something from a theatrical production, all projection and no substance. Everyone remain calm. I've managed this crisis expertly. Security, take him into custody immediately. Rachel was still holding the 4-line steady, monitoring the dextrose flow. She didn't look up. She simply stated to the security chief with the same clinical certainty she'd used on Michael, he had a diabetic emergency. Severe hypoglycemia, likely diabetic ketoacidosis developing. He needs continuous glucose monitoring, Anne. Dr. Caldwell's hand clamped around her arm like a vice. he pulled her into the stairwell, the door slamming shut behind them, cutting off the sounds of the recovery ward, leaving only the hum of the fluorescent lights and the sound of his breathing, which had the particular harshness of a man whose control had just evaporated in front of 4 security officers and a room full of nursing staff. "You just engaged an armed subject without authorization," he spat. His face had gone purple. His voice had taken on a quality like breaking glass. "You violated every single hospital protocol. You endangered staff lives. Your contract is terminated effective immediately. Leave the building." Rachel's voice didn't waver. Didn't inflect. Didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing a crack form anywhere. He was having a medical emergency. He was a criminal with a gun, Dr. Caldwell screamed, and Rachel understood in that moment that this man had built his entire professional identity on being the one who controlled situations, who made decisions, who occupied the center of the room. She had just walked toward a man with a loaded weapon and talked him down in 90 seconds. There was no universe in which Dr. Caldwell could recover his authority from that. "Leave," he said, his voice dropping to something colder. "Security will escort you out. Don't come back." Rachel removed her badge in silence, the gesture itself a kind of farewell, a closing of a door that had never really been opened to her. She walked out into the rain at 11:57 p.m., her civilian clothes clinging to her skin, the parking lot empty except for the sound of water on asphalt and the distant wail of an ambulance on the highway. 2 hours later, standing at Marcus's grave in a cemetery on the edge of Raleigh where the rain hadn't stopped and probably wouldn't, Rachel pressed the dog tag cold against her palm. The broken chain had been replaced 1,000 times over the years, but the tag itself, her husband's tag, had never left her skin. She whispered into the darkness, "I'm sorry, Marcus. I tried to stay invisible like they ordered me to. I tried to be just a nurse. But I couldn't just let people die." Water streamed down her face, and she didn't know anymore if it was rain or something else. The rain was loud enough now that no one would have heard her cry even if she had allowed herself to. But she wouldn't. That kind of breaking was a luxury she'd trained herself out of somewhere between Tikrit and the day the Pentagon ordered her to disappear. The machinery had finally ground her to a halt. But it would turn again. Things like that always did. Dr. Caldwell emerged from behind the locked office door the moment security cleared the recovery ward. His jaw was tight, his posture controlled. He found the hospital administrator standing near the nurse's station, clipboard in hand, still processing what had just happened. Before anyone else could speak, Caldwell moved toward him with the measured stride of a man accustomed to dominating conversations. "Strategic de-escalation protocols," Caldwell said, his voice steady and authoritative. "I guided the situation from inception. Assessed the threat level, maintained visual contact, calculated the optimal moment for intervention. Textbook crisis management." He exhaled slowly, as if exhausted by his own competence. The individual's mental state was deteriorating. Diabetic shock, most likely. I recognized the symptoms early and coordinated the response. The administrator nodded, writing something down. Relief was visible in his shoulders, relief that the crisis had ended, relief that someone in authority had apparently orchestrated it. Caldwell had built his entire career on this, the ability to rewrite events while they were still warm, to claim credit before anyone else could organize a counter-narrative. Rachel stood at the edge of the group, for supplies still in her hands, the gunman's blood beginning to dry on her scrubs. She hadn't moved. Hadn't spoken. Hadn't even washed her hands yet. She watched Caldwell construct his narrative with the precision of someone laying bricks, and for a moment she simply let him build. Then she stepped forward. "That's not accurate, Dr. Caldwell." Her voice was quiet. Flat. The kind of voice that doesn't raise for emphasis because it doesn't need to. "You remained locked in your office during the entire incident. I performed the de-escalation. I assessed the patient's glucose levels. I started the 4." The administrator's pen stopped moving. Caldwell's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a hardening, like metal cooling. He turned to face Rachel directly, and the other nurses suddenly became very busy with their tasks. This was the moment where the hierarchy of the hospital reasserted itself, where a temp nurse challenged a director in front of witnesses and learned the cost of that choice. "You performed an unauthorized engagement with an armed subject," Caldwell said, his voice still controlled but with an edge now, sharp as a suture needle. "You placed yourself and staff at risk. You violated every protocol we have regarding active threats. That behavior, that recklessness, is exactly why temporary staff create liability." He paused. "Let that sink in. Your contract is terminated, effective immediately." Dr. Caldwell, the administrator, started. "She overstepped. She created a dangerous situation. She needs to leave." Caldwell's voice dropped lower. "And we'll need to discuss whether she should be permitted to work at any facility in this region." It wasn't a request. It was a threat with bureaucratic teeth. Rachel didn't respond. She set the 4 supplies on the counter, removed her badge, and walked toward the stairwell. Caldwell followed her, moving fast enough that the administrator didn't have time to intervene. When the stairwell door closed behind them, the sound echoed like a lock clicking. Caldwell didn't raise his voice. That was the truly terrifying thing. He spoke in measured, clinical tones, as if discussing a patient's prognosis rather than destroying someone's livelihood. "You made a choice tonight," he said. "You chose to be a hero instead of a nurse. Heroes get fired. Heroes get blacklisted. Heroes end up driving for Uber because nobody will hire them." He stepped closer. "I have 15 years of professional relationships in this region. 15 years of phone calls I can make. Every hospital administrator from here to Chapel Hill will know your name before Friday. Not as the hero. As the liability. The temp who couldn't follow orders. The one who goes rogue when adrenaline kicks in." Rachel stood on the landing, hand on the railing. She didn't turn around. "You're terminated. Clear your locker by end of shift. Don't come back." The stairwell door closed. Rachel stood in the silence, that particular silence of fluorescent lights and concrete and the weight of doors that don't open back up. She descended the stairs slowly, her boots on each step like a countdown. The exit led to the parking lot, where rain had begun to fall, where the night was waiting. 3 hours later, Rachel stood at the grave of Marcus Torres, her husband of 18 years, dead now for 4. The rain came down in sheets, the kind of rain that tastes like metal and forgetting. She held the dog tag in her palm, the single one that remained, the other buried here with him, and the metal was cold enough to hurt. "I'm sorry, Marcus," she whispered. "I tried to stay invisible like they ordered. I tried to become nobody. But I couldn't just let people die." The rain hammered down. The grass beneath her feet was soaked. "Couldn't do it. Couldn't be the ghost they wanted me to be." She pressed the dog tag against her chest, feeling the edge of it through her wet scrubs, and for a moment she let herself break, not in front of Caldwell, not in front of the hospital, but here, alone with the dead. The rain washed her tears away before anyone could see them, and when she finally walked back to her car, she was dry. What Rachel didn't know was that Dr. Caldwell wasn't finished rewriting the narrative. He went straight to his office after firing her and began creating the documentation that would justify his version of events. The incident report he typed detailed his strategic de-escalation protocol, his heroic intervention, his professional assessment that prevented further escalation. He backdated performance reviews that were never originally filed, altered shift logs to manufacture policy violations, and forwarded everything to the hospital's legal department with a cover memo about emerging liability concerns regarding temporary staff. But what Caldwell also didn't know was that 8 witnesses had watched Rachel walk toward the gunman. 8 nurses had seen him lock himself in his office. 8 people were prepared to contradict his narrative, and the visiting nurse who'd read Rachel's personnel file was already on her phone with the hospital administrator before Caldwell even finished typing. Thursday morning, Rachel was packing her locker when she heard her son's voice echo through the empty hallway. "Mom." She turned. Her 16-year-old son stood in the corridor in his school uniform, holding a wooden box, his face flushed with the kind of determination that comes from 16-year-olds who've just figured out their parents are human. "Mom, I need to tell you something," he said. "I found something in the attic. I found a lot of things." Rachel felt her stomach drop. She knew exactly what was in that attic. The reason she'd hidden it there. The reason she'd never spoken about it, never showed him, never let him know who his mother actually was. "Sweetheart, this isn't the time. I know about Tikrit." The words landed like a defibrillator shock. "I know about the unit. I know about the medals. I found your discharge paperwork. I saw your rank." He held the box out to her. His hands were shaking. "I don't understand why you never told me. I don't understand why you let that doctor talk to you like that." Rachel couldn't speak. That afternoon, the hospital administrator called an emergency hearing. Rachel received notification at 1:02 p.m. via email with a terse message requesting her presence at 3 p.m. in the board conference room. She almost didn't go. But her son was already in the parking lot, box in hand, determination in his eyes, and he'd said 4 words that made her understand they need to see these. The conference room was silent when she entered. The hospital administrator sat at the head of the table. Dr. Caldwell was there, confident, already mentally composing his resignation letter for a position he would claim to be accepting at a more prestigious facility. 3 board members flanked him. A visiting nurse stood near the window, the personnel file in her trembling hands. Rachel's son walked directly to the center of the table and placed the wooden box down with the care of someone handling something sacred. "Open it," he said to his mother. And that's when the room changed. That's when everything Caldwell had spent 3 days constructing began to crack. The real fight hadn't started yet. It was about to. And for the first time in 8 years, Rachel Torres was about to stop running from who she actually was. The question now wasn't whether she would survive this. The question was whether she would reclaim her identity or accept erasure one final time. And as her son looked at her across that conference table, as the medals began to catch the fluorescent light, Rachel's answer became clear. This is a story about what happens when someone realizes that invisibility isn't safety, it's just another form of surrender. If this resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment about a time you had to reclaim your identity. These stories matter because someone's watching right now who needs to know they're not alone.